This is the part where I tell myself I'm going to keep this month-long wrap-up really short, but we both know I'm not. First up, The Bird King by G. Willow Wilson. This is in historical fantasy set at the height of the Spanish Inquisition. It follows the Muslim character Fatima and her friend Hassan. It is own voices. G. Willow Wilson is Muslim, and it is very evocative of that time period. Hassan and Fatima are hated both for being Muslim and Hassan for being both gay and having supernatural magic-y powers. I loved the first 300 pages. The last 100 kind of lost it for me. Felt like it came from another book. If you would like to hear my thoughts more in depth, I did an entire review on it. You can find that on the channel. But overall, I would definitely suggest this. Definitely recommend it. It comes out March 12th of this year. Secondly, I read I'm Much Better on Paper by Kristen Hunt. This is a fairly short poetry novel by a poet of color talking about things like racism and sexism that she's faced before. Fairly short, like I said, 30 pages. So great if you need to up that Goodreads goal just a little bit. This is also on the indie authors list that I mentioned before because I am trying to get more books off of there. This was fairly eye-opening. There are some essays about conversations she's had both with friends and with her parents that definitely offers a unique perspective that I hadn't read before, so I very much enjoyed that and recommend it. Up next, Honors Flight by Lindsay Broker. I have gushed about the first one so much. I was really nervous going into this that it wouldn't be as good as what I had been hyping, but I still loved it, still love the story. I'm still pretty sure there's a slow burn romance, but it is the slowest of burns. I really can't give you too much without ruining the first. It's kind of the problem with trying to read and review sequels to anything, but again, still my favorite. I'm glad it lived up to my expectations. Up next was The Girls at 17 Swan Street. I have the physical copy of this and then I loaned it to my mom. So title cover here. So this book is very hard to read from a thematic standpoint. It follows Anna as she combats anorexia in a group home with other girls that are combating other eating disorders. It's very non-linear in storytelling, very poetic. You will be very uncomfortable for a large part of it. You will get very frustrated if you read it. However, it is a very blunt take on the eating disorder. I'm not entirely sure if it's own voices. Yara Jeeb, the author, may have had an eating disorder. It's not clear, and obviously that's not something you just outright ask. So I get the feeling that she's had some experience with it, so to some extent it's own voices, but I'm not quite sure to what extent. However, I would highly suggest that as well. That comes out February. I'm gonna forget. I'll have it somewhere up here. But again, not an easy read from a thematic standpoint, but a unique read, and one that I would definitely suggest if you've never come into contact with that kind of struggle before, which I have not, so it was very eye-opening. And again, I also reviewed that, so somewhere on the channel, maybe I'll link it, I don't know. You can check out the full review of that one. Looking at my list, ooh, this is a fun one. Up next, Clash of Eagles by Alan Smale. I actually discovered this at the library. It took me like 45 minutes because I just could not find anything that sounded good. It was like when you're hungry but like nothing to eat sounds good. I was just going through synopsis after synopsis at the library and nothing sounded any decent. And then I found this. This is an alternative history where the Roman Empire does not fall to the Huns but actually continues on. I believe this takes place during the 13th century, if I remember correctly. It's hard to tell. But instead of them falling to the Huns or falling apart entirely as in history, they soldier on, and this follows a Roman, I believe it's praetor, I'm never quite sure. There's a lot of Romanesque terminology in here, as they come into what they term Nova Hesperia, aka North America. So you've got Roman centurions going up against Native American tribes. Now, I was very iffy about this at first, even though it sounded intriguing. I'm like, okay, how are they going to represent the North American tribes? And it's actually pretty cool. The North American tribes, I believe, they talk about the Iroquois, the Powhatan, I believe. They talk about a couple. Everything is like kind of what you would expect, or kind of what you know about the tribes, but their names are slightly altered in some cases, so it's hard to know exactly what tribe they're referring to in certain instances. But the tribes are badasses, and they can go toe-to-toe with the Roman centurions, and they have their own alternate history technology, which was really cool. I really liked it. It is the first in a trilogy, so the ending definitely leaves you wanting to move on to the next book, and it probably will eventually, but I kind of got this thing where I don't rush into the next in a series because I want to make it last. I want to draw it out. I don't want to jump right into it and then leave me with a huge book hangover afterwards. So skipping in between series is like taking a drink of water between shots. You know how you sure, let's go with that. Next up, The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This has popped up a lot on my channel lately. From the beginning, it was in my BookTube newbie tag. I love this book. This was a reread of a favorite for my Pop Sugar Challenge, which I'll talk about more when I get to that video. But if you don't know, this follows a girl named Mary Lennox who was born and raised in India and is a total spoiled brat, raised by negligent parents who basically handed her off to a nanny and don't really care. Those parents then die of cholera, and Mary is sent to live with her uncle, a man she's never met, in England on the moors, and she doesn't really know what to make of it. But it ends up being the best thing for her. It changes her for the better, both physically and mentally. This book also had my very first fictional boyfriend. Dickon Sowerby was my greatest fictional boyfriend when I was a kid. It's creepy to think of now because he's 12, but I was 9 when I read this, so it wasn't creepy then. But definitely, if you've never read this, I would highly suggest it. Reading the Yorkshire accents can be a little bit tricky. I'm not even quite sure how I got through it at 9, but it is heartwarming and delightful. And if you like a good redemption arc, this is definitely your pick. This has 3 different redemption arcs for 3 different characters. So I love it. Looking back at my magical notebook, next. Aha! Starmark Rising by Shami Stovall, another book that I reviewed and loved, only this one was actually sent to me by the author. This is a indie sci-fi space opera involving Clevon DeMarco and Endelian Voigt as they both navigate a world with a very strict genetic hierarchy where humans are not allowed to rule, except Endelian, which I believe that's supposed to be her on the cover, I'm not sure. Can't remember, wants to become a planet governor, and which is a little bit of a task because no humans are allowed to be planet governors. Now, admittedly, planet governor is one of my pet peeves. If you've watched my 5 sci-fi pet peeves, you'll know that. But this has so much other to recommend it that I don't even mind. I gave it 5 stars. Again, I gave it a full review, so you can watch that as well. I told the author, hey, remember me for the next one. Now, this comes out February 12th, I believe, and I would definitely suggest you get this. If you like indie books, if you like sci-fi books, there's explosions. So many explosions. It's great. Get it. What did I read next? A random book. Royally Screwed by Sienna Blake. This was my first foray into reverse harem romances, and I believe this is also on the indie author list. This involves a young woman who falls for a prince while she's working at the hotel, but the prince has this weird kind of deal where he can't sleep with her unless both of his bodyguards are also involved to essentially keep himself from falling for the girl, I think was the general explanation. Not the best. It was like, I think less than 150 pages. It was kind of whatever. Didn't really feel like a reversed harem. Just felt like we need an excuse to have all the interesting 4-person sex scenes as opposed to the other 2 having any real effect on the story. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to see if I can't find a reverse harem that actually lives up to the term, although I'm starting to wonder if that's just how they're all going to be. I'll try to stay hopeful. All right, up next. Gemini by Carol Casella. This was one I basically, again, just read it for a Pop Sugar prompt. It's kind of whatever. It kind of felt like reading an episode of Grey's Anatomy. This involves a young woman who was a doctor in an emergency room and has a Jane Doe who was hit by a car come into her emergency room and the ICU, actually. And she's basically trying to keep her alive without really knowing who she is and investigating it, and it ends up being way more connected to her life than she thought. The Gemini, the title is actually kind of a surprise, so I won't talk about that, but the Gemini does actually matter, which I was wondering for most of the book. I think did I give this 3 stars? I don't remember. I don't remember half of the star ratings I give half the time. It's nice. If you like Grey's Anatomy, you'll like this. Definitely you'll like this. Although I found out, as much as I don't mind hearing medical terminology when they talk about it on TV, I'm really not the biggest fan of reading it. I found that out. All right, next up. Origin by Dave Higgins. This was, again, for the Pop Sugar prompt, but also off the indie author list. Origin is an lit RPG, which is a really hard genre to define, but essentially they live in a world where the D&D stats, your wisdom, your luck, your strength, are all known to people. So rather than them being invisible numbers that the character never knows about, they're aware of, oh, my intelligence is set at 4, or what have you. And it follows the main character, Edmund, who wants to be a great scholar, but has little intelligence because his parents put all of his points into luck. He was meant to be purely lucky, and so he's basically living as a village idiot because he's got no other way. But he's determined to make it work. This is a very short book, about 99 pages, so again, Goodreads goal. It's also the beginning of a series. I get the gist that most of them are going to be that short, so it's probably one you could breeze through fairly quickly. It was very tongue-in-cheek in that, everyone is aware of, oh, my luck is really high, my intelligence is at the default level, and also just thinking of a world where parents get to pick their child's attributes at birth and decide their luck, their intelligence, their strength, whatever, is really, really kind of scary. But it's interesting, and I enjoyed it. Let's see. Yes, and last but not least, Bitter Waters by Wen Spencer. This is another one of those books where I read it without realizing that you have to read the other ones first. Well, not quite like I got the story without it, but this follows Ukiah Oregon, who is basically an alien who both has lived on Earth for like hundreds of years, but also only has the mindset of like, I think in this book he's supposed to be like mid-20s because of weird alien memory stuff, and if he loses a part of his body, it turns into a mouse. It's very weird. This was published in 2003, I believe, and I've mentioned it before, but early 2000 sci-fi is like its own particular brand of strange. Just, they hold nothing back, and so I probably am going to go read the first 2 books in the series before this one, basically because there's a lot of mentions of their big alien enemies that you don't fully understand until you've read those, I believe. It has a fairly high rating on Goodreads too. When I checked, I was very impressed. Usually paperbacks like these don't get that high rating, but apparently it's got a pretty dedicated fan base, and I like that. The main character was fairly likable. All the characters were actually pretty likable, which is great because that way, even if I didn't quite understand what the big alien terminology or weaponry or centuries-long feuds were about, I still enjoyed listening to the characters. So I'm probably going to keep going to this one. I would tell you to go into this, to pick up this one, but I'm pretty sure it's out of print. Because I picked it up at a used bookstore for super cheap now that I think about it. So I'm probably going to have to get better at going like on Amazon and buying used books. But definitely would suggest that one if you're into sci-fi weirdness. So it's a pretty good month. 11 books. I don't have the number of pages in front of me, but I'm going all out because I've got Pop Sugar and the Goodreads goal, and I'm currently at 11 books out of 100, so I'm over 10% of the way there, which means I think, according to Goodreads, I'm 3 books ahead, and I'm actually going to be doing a 2019 goals check-in sometime in March, I think, because I want to keep checking in on my goals and make sure that I'm sticking to them. So I would love to know what you guys have read this month. I'll probably be watching a couple other wrap-ups, but if you've read any books like these, if you've ever done Bookish First, if you've read any books that are coming out that you loved, please let me know. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to as well. With nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.